Go ahead and get started. So, before we dive in, thank you, Amber, for that wonderful introduction. I also just wanted to give a little background as well about who I am and why I'll be talking about what I'm talking about today. My name is Dana Frayne. I'm at the University of Oxford as a master's student, and specifically, I'm at the Internet Institute. So I spend my days thinking about how the internet essentially affects society, particularly in relation to how the internet is accessible online. Before coming to Oxford, I was already quite interested in digital accessibility. So I don't think it surprised any of my friends or people who know me that I wanted to study this for my master's thesis. In particular, like Amber said, I worked as a freelance digital accessibility consultant, and one of my projects working on the American Civil Liberties Union homepage, so that it was accessible was really great. So currently finishing up the master's degree at Oxford, and I'm going to be talking about some of my thesis findings today, as well as, some of my personal experiences working in digital accessibility. So, sort of the agenda for the talk today. First, I'm going to kind of give an overview of my research goals, and then transition to a brief discussion of the theoretical frameworks that are kind of driving that question. Then I'm going to be examining briefly the method I use, and then the findings and future directions. So the main takeaway from my background earlier is that I am coming from both a practical perspective on one side, but then also a theoretical, more academic perspective. And I mentioned my coursework at Oxford, and that involves a thesis, which one of the main requirements is having a research question. So on the screen now is mine, which says, what is the role of social norms in the implementation of digital accessibility practices in the technology industry? So with this question, I was essentially working toward figuring out and observing the different norms that operate when people are trying to put digital accessibility policies into practice. So one question I've gotten is why study this particular topic? And there are a few reasons. The first one being that I have found there is a gap in the academic literature regarding social norms and digital accessibility, partially because there is not, I'd say, a great deal of academic research that sort of publicly exists squarely on the topic of digital accessibility. Furthermore, the research that does exist is often it can be siloed into niche topics and circles. So sometimes there is a risk of being sort of put into echo chambers of people who already feel quite strongly about digital accessibility. And then, for the research that does exist, the data does not always, cover the aspect of implementation. So particularly in the technology industry, sometimes I've found that the viewpoints can be a bit disconnected between, industry versus academia. So one of the goals of my research is to sort of, merge these two viewpoints together. Not that they exist, completely separately, but that was one of the goals. And then, secondly, or second, digital accessibility is highly interdisciplinary, which I'm sure a lot of people tuning in can relate to this idea that to work in digital accessibility, sometimes it feels like, you specialize in a lot of different areas, from, the technical part to the legal part to, the theory part, and there are lots of different parts to it. So I that was another reason I wanted to kind of address social norms, because they touch on, all of those areas. And then finally, the third reason, which is the main reason I wanted to study this, is, my main personal experiences with digital accessibility and working in digital accessibility. I feel like I have, personally experienced these social norms that I'm going to talk about. And my hope in bringing them up today is that, maybe, someone tuning in will also have experienced this. And I think as a community of people who care about digital accessibility, it's important to, kind of rally around, advocating for digital accessibility. So that's kind of the goal with my research, and the goal that I have today. And I think that's partially why events like these are so great, because it brings the community together. So moving on into the research itself, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time defining theories and frameworks, but I've included the major theorists, um, uh, in parentheses here on the screen, along with, their associated theories. So if you're interested and want to learn more about anything I'm talking about, I have a list of references at the end if you want to check out these theories further. But the first one says the social model of disability, and Mike Oliver and Tom Shakespeare are two of the leading architects of this framework, and it has its foundations in the United Kingdom, sort of the activist grassroots movement. When there was a big push from the medical model of disability to the social model. And the conception of the social model was, founded in this idea that social barriers blocked participation in social groups. So this is a problem because, uh, this potentially could lead to obstacles for people with disabilities to lead a fulfilling and high quality of life. And I mentioned this here primarily because the social model is now the primary mode in which scholars studying the topic of disability utilize. And it's therefore, the model that drives this research. Just gonna take a sip real quick. Okay, well, so moving on to the next theory I have listed. So intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a brilliant feminist scholar. She, coined and is one of the lead architects of this concept, intersectionality, which essentially means that aspects of identity are fluid as opposed to concrete, single artifacts of oneself, and self-presentation. And in other words, intersectionality is sort of this idea that multiple identities, like dimensions of identity, like race, socioeconomic status, gender, ability, so on, they deserve an equitable weight when kind of considering identity politics. So based on this, cornerstone theory, I'd say it's fair to suggest that disability is intertwined with, a lot of different dimensions of identity. So when talking about this research, I feel like it's really important to acknowledge that, disability doesn't, essentially exist in a vacuum. It's, there are lots of parts of identity to think about. So I just want to note up front that I try to, incorporate intersectionality into my research and just general life approach. And then, moving on to the next framework, the narrative self, which is proposed by and really led by this philosopher named Mara Schechtman. And you know she essentially, the narrative self presents this idea that a cohesive collection of one's memories and ideas about the self come together to present the self presentation. So in other words, whenever I hear someone say this is on brand for this person, I sort of think of this theory because it's essentially the Schexman's idea that presentations of the self, it's a collection of different memories and artifacts that are shared online. So With these theories in mind, I'm going to transition to a discussion of the findings and the process of gathering the findings. So for my thesis, I conducted a series of interviews with accessibility experts and practitioners. And it's important to note that the primary framework that I used was the postmodernist viewpoint, because it was really, I related to it a lot because it emphasized the nuanced nature of, the interviewer and the interviewee relationship, along with the broader philosophical belief that, multiple versions of the truth can exist in society. Um, Also, I was conscientious about the broader postmodernist push in academia to adhere to equitable sampling practices in order to better represent diverse experiences in the findings. Oh, I'm just gonna Okay, sorry. I feel like I'm battling a bit of a cold coming on, so sorry about that. Okay, back to it. So the second point was that just another minor no is that one of my concerns with the interview method was sometimes people can say, interviews purely produce descriptive findings, but I would kind of push back against this idea in the sense that interviews are useful, particularly in sort of sociological research, to uncover social norms and some perspectives that can sometimes be hidden. So now I'm going to shift to a discussion of the findings. And to do that, I am going to read off a brief scenario. Okay, so I'm going to read what's on screen now. So imagine that you're working at a company that is launching a new website tomorrow. You primarily work as a product designer, but you're considered the go-to person for digital accessibility in the company. You don't personally work on the team that's preparing for launch, but a manager from a different team knows that you know a lot about accessibility. This manager emails you to ask, hey, can you make the website accessible before the launch tomorrow? Less than a day is not a lot of time to make a website accessible, but you really want to help because no one else in the company seems to know about the specific accessibility guidelines. So you ask the manager, sure, but what has already been done for accessibility? They respond by saying, we only just remembered because we don't want to get in trouble with an inaccessible site. If you could just check the boxes for the basic accessibility criteria before launch, that would be great. Okay, so let's dissect this for a moment. I cannot see the comments right now, but I would venture to ask if anyone listening or watching has ever experienced a scenario similar to this. I know bits and pieces of this. I certainly have, but essentially, I wanted to share this fictional scenario that sort of drawn from some truths that I experience, because it represents all three of the social norms that I'm going to talk about today. So the three social norms, like I mentioned in the agenda, are, so the first one's compliance culture, which I think hopefully a lot of people will find interesting. And then the second one is valuation of accessibility work. And then the third one is educational opportunities. So now I'm going to transition into a discussion of each of these social norms, um, by talking about what they are, how they play a role in digital accessibility, and then why they exist. So first, compliance culture. In relation to digital accessibility is a concept that's discussed a great deal in actually Professor Sarah Luthwaite's research. She focuses on studying the pedagogy of digital accessibility. So her research is really fascinating. And if you're interested in learning more about compliance culture, I would definitely recommend looking up some of her articles, or you can email me afterwards and I can, send you some as well. But uh, anyways, as a concept, compliance culture is this idea that digital accessibility is only a set of rules to abide by, as opposed to a genuine, approach to accessibility that reinforces creativity and continuity. And I also want to note here before moving forward that just the name itself, compliance culture, can potentially be misleading in the sense, when I first heard about it, I was a bit confused because on its own, I'd argue that compliance is a good thing. Complying with policies shows that, people care, but the main difference between compliance versus compliance culture is, it graduates from being this, practice to, an attitude and set of behaviors, making it more aligned with the social norm. So that's when it becomes more of an issue. And this relates to digital accessibility because, in interviews with digital accessibility practitioners working in the technology industry, there was this repeated theme about the ongoing effort to kind of stymie the practices of compliance culture because, compliance culture can block uh, sustainability of continued accessibility practices, particularly because it can sort of stand as a roadblock between working towards creativity, innovation, and a continuous accessibility process as opposed to this static, rigid set of rules. So going back to the scenario I presented, I wanted to highlight this particular part that sort of exemplifies this idea. So um, on the screen, it says the quote, "We only just remembered because we don't want to get in trouble with an accessible site." This is coming from the perspective of the manager. "If you could just check the boxes for the basic accessibility criteria before launch, that would be great." So this certainly has elements of compliance culture, in particular, there's this sense of urgency we only just remembered. This is a problem because accessibility should certainly be in an ideal world, accessibility should be incorporated from the very beginning of the product development process for a multitude of reasons. But in particular, one of those reasons is that it prevents sort of this last minute stressful time of trying to make something accessible really quick, because it's sort of changes from this, process of, okay, how can we make this user experience a good one, as opposed to, okay, how can we quickly just, meet the very basic accessibility criteria so we don't get in trouble. Those are two different, there are significant differences between those two approaches. And that's sort of where compliance culture is really relevant. So before moving on to the next social norm, I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on, some reasons why I think compliance culture exists. And regarding the theoretical concerns, I think this represents sort of a quick fix mentality in the technology industry because, from my experience, uh, working in tech, I have found that, there are, pressures to work quickly and launch things quickly. And, I think that's good for, innovation. However, I think in order for accessibility to, exist in that sort of very fast process, it's essential that it's an ongoing consideration as opposed to, okay, let's look at this right before we launch. Um, and then something also that, I've been thinking about, and some other scholars in this space, like Professor Gerard Grogan and Professor Sarah Luthwaite also have, produced research on, also other great scholars, but essentially there's this debate where sometimes the definitions of accessibility, the policies of accessibility can be quite broad. So sometimes it can feel difficult to know exactly what to do in order to make this something accessible when if someone doesn't know how to make something accessible, which I talk further about in the upcoming norms. And then the last 2 points, practical constraints. So again, time constraints are a consideration, and availability of resources. So again, with this this scenario presented, trying to make something accessible in a very short amount of time, and there's, putting all the responsibility on one person can be quite difficult. The scenario didn't mention how, expansive the product was, so that can again be quite challenging. So moving on to the next main social norm, I wanted to talk about the attitudes and behaviors associated with the valuation of digital accessibility work. And here I want to kind of pause for clarity. When I say valuation, I am talking about both the financial and opportunity cost associated with the work of digital accessibility. So the first point I want to address is that the values associated with digital accessibility work are quite varied, based on industry and location and a lot of different factors. And also, going back to Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, there are a lot of factors at play with cost and value. So so I want to make sure I clarify here that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. However, there is this trend that I noticed in my research and personal experience that this, it is not always accessibility work is not always, compensated fairly, in my opinion. And one of the most common ways that this manifest is, and maybe some people watching or listening have had this experience where people who are, experts or knowledgeable even in digital accessibility practices are called on to do the work of multiple people. And so by this, I mean that sometimes digital accessibility is sort of viewed as maybe a side project or optional. And, in this scenario, uh, this person is sort of, it's not clear whether this person is going to be compensated or recognized properly, for their work. Um, and the second point I want to make, the second point I want to make about this is that the valuation of accessibility work often it can coexist alongside this phenomenon of being siloed into an accessibility maintenance role, even when the job description doesn't call for it. And sort of by this, I mean that accessibility work requires flexibility, as I mentioned earlier with compliance culture. Accessibility, in my view, is a continuous, ongoing process. So when it's viewed through a lens of, being optional or not as valued, that really puts a strain on the whole process, because it doesn't necessarily give the space that's needed for digital accessibility to really prosper and be successful. So returning to the example presented earlier, the way this issue of value presents itself is through the following quote on the screen, which says, "A manager from a different team knows that you know a lot about accessibility." So, reflecting on this for a moment, the way the social norm manifested in this scenario is that it's not clear from this scenario that accessibility is considered a part of this, person's usual accessibilities. It's noted that the person is knowledgeable. However, it's also noted that they are primarily a product designer. So you can kind of assume that they, their whole job isn't focused on accessibility, which, presents a different scenario, but it's not clear, the main point I'm trying to make here is it's not clear whether this person is going to be compensated, for their time, working on this accessibility process. It's sort of presented as a favor, um, as opposed to, you're gonna get, recognition for your work, which is really, really important in terms of value. And then the other point I want to mention, which is not specifically mentioned in this slide, but the general attitude sort of this manager kind of signals to me a lack of um, recognition for the accessibility process as again being continuous process that should be incorporated from the very beginning when possible. So this sort of leads to the question of why do these valuation challenges exist in the first place? Well, in my opinion, the answer is quite complicated. So I'd argue that there are a lot of parallels that exist, with the broader disability rights movement. And I'm looking at the time. For sake of time, it's sort of hard to dive into that now. But if you want to talk more about that, definitely send me an email, and I'd love to talk about it. But essentially, the main relationship here is that I argue that the struggle with value is part of an overarching, broader perspective that exists in the technology industry, where stakeholders don't necessarily recognize accessibility work with the value of other disciplines, other technical skills. Um, and that this is a problem because this can manifest in different ways where maybe someone doesn't get promoted or recognized in the same way that other people do, because if the employers don't recognize, okay, accessibility work, it's very significant, it's important, and it's critical to a product having a strong usable experience, that can create significant problems. And then the second part of this, where sometimes accessibility can sort of be viewed through this lens of volunteering, where, as I mentioned earlier, it's unclear whether this person in this scenario is going to be properly compensated for their time, and if this is just a favor, um, that doesn't really, help with accessibility being properly recognized. And last point I want to make about this before moving to the next social norm is, I personally struggle with this. And maybe people tuning in as well really struggle, because as someone who's really passionate about digital accessibility, I'm really happy when people express interest in it, even if it is last minute, or you know even if it is challenging. So I'm definitely more inclined to, I want to help as much as I can, but that can also present a challenge when even if I help, if my work isn't valued in the same way. It can be quite frustrating. So on that note, moving to the third and final social norm that I'm going to discuss today is the specific attitudes and behaviors that people face when, first entering the field of digital accessibility, specifically in relation to educational opportunities for accessibility. Okay, so a recurring theme was that the offerings for digital accessibility education are not particularly robust in comparison to other skills, other technical skills in design and development. And the repercussions for these lack of accessibility resources is, widespread. And I kind of want to focus this section on a couple key points. But, one of the points I have listed on screen is that there is no, one pathway to studying digital accessibility, which on the one hand is good because, you know, I personally relate to this idea that I have picked up lessons about digital accessibility on the job, which helps in terms of learning practical ways to apply accessibility. But at the same time, if one doesn't have access to work opportunities to learn, it can make things quite difficult to gather digital accessibility, specific practices, which leads to kind of the third point I have here, which is there is I have found, as well as in my research, that there are pretty significant differences that exist between, learning about accessibility from this theoretical perspective versus implementing it. And, there are lots of, before moving on, I do want to mention, there are lots of great resources and classes out there. And, if you have any favorite classes or things, I would love to, see them in the comments. But I wanted to note, in terms of mainstream educational options, I would say there are not any major degrees that specify in digital accessibility. There are minors, certificates, online classes, which are great, but I think if, for example, if there was a master's degree in digital accessibility, I would totally want to enroll in that. But from my search, there is not, and that can, that is sort of a challenge in and of itself, because stakeholders at universities and educational programs do not always recognize accessibility work with the value of other disciplines. So one way this manifests specifically is, from people I've talked to, accessibility can, be incorporated into computer science classes, or sometimes even have a whole course dedicated to accessibility, which is great. But I feel like, and I feel like this is a common feeling, but accessibility is so expansive. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, it's hard to sort of narrow it down versus into, theory versus practice. So I feel like if there was more room and more recognition of digital accessibility in these mainstream educational places and spaces, I should say, that would lead to more widespread education. Okay, so through this example, the social norm sort of manifested through the quote, "You primarily work as a product designer, but you're considered the quote, go-to person for digital accessibility in the company." So sort of from what I've gathered, particularly at smaller companies and startups, it's sort of not uncommon for there to be sort of this, go-to person for accessibility, which is fine. But I think, I think in an ideal world, it would be amazing if, every person had at least a foundation in accessibility, because, accessibility doesn't exist in this vacuum. It's not just, an engineering concern, design concern, content concern, recruiting concern, it really exists widespread. So I think it's not particularly fair for the, responsibility to be with one person. So sort of one way to combat this is for, education to be more widespread. And at the university, training, crash course level, more accessibility knowledge would be good. But employers can also, have a role in this, when, new employees are being onboarded. It'd be great if accessibility is discussed and, acknowledged, and specific practices for that company are shared. So it's not sort of reliant on one person. Okay, so wrapping up, we're about at 35 minutes. So I think about 5 to 10 more minutes, and then I'd love to take any questions for a bit. But the first future direction is, I think it's really important for um, people working in digital accessibility to work towards combating solutionism. So I should say here, solutionism is sort of a concept designed by this theorist, Morozov, who I cite more in the references. But essentially, solutionism is this idea that there is a goal of solving problems, as opposed to, actually addressing the complexity of problems that exist in the technology industry. And I think this is quite relevant to digital accessibility, because digital accessibility, as I mentioned, is quite complex. Not only is it an ongoing process, but it's very widespread and interdisciplinary. So it's critical that it's viewed in that light. It's not just, ticking the specific boxes of policy, but it's recognized as a comprehensive, widespread consideration. So some concrete ways to address this would be, making sure that every person in, a company or a product team is knowledgeable about at least the basics of accessibility, but also, consistently testing with users to make sure, okay, this product, um, you know, testing with users with disabilities. So there's an open line of communication, and that you're recognizing that, okay, the goal is to make this a good usability experience, not just to, tick off some boxes. Then the second future direction is there's really a critical need to increase the value of accessibility work. And like I said earlier, this is not, there are certainly exceptions to this. However, I would say, a trend that I'm kind of concerned about is, um, it's not always the value of accessibility work is not always, I think, given the recognition that it deserves. And, stakeholders in the tech industry certainly play a role in this, but, also, anyone on a product team just, advocating for accessibility, calling out the work, supporting, people who also work in accessibility is, a great way to address this. And then finally, which is probably the future direction that I'm most excited about, is this, starting point that I want to suggest is that integrating creativity into the conversation is really a great way, I think, to draw greater interest and respect of digital accessibility. Greater interest and respect in the technology industry. And, you know, there are a lot of great art projects in this space, which, you know, I can also share links to if you want to email me afterwards. But essentially, creativity is, you know, a great um, vehicle for, you know, approaching digital access. And sort of to, you know, wrap up, I wanted to say, you know, stakeholder changes are, you know, critical. Creative approaches are great. And then collaboration in the accessibility community is also, you know, really important, which is why, you know, events like this are really exciting. And you know, I'm really excited to be a part of this, and, you know, connect and, you know, virtually meet people who also really care about digital access. So that's it. These are my references. The slides are available at the WordPress accessibility site if you want to, you know, go through the references. You can also send me an email. My email is dana.frayne@gmail.com. And also my Twitter handle is Dana_Frayne. I just wanted to thank quickly, you know, Joe Dolson and the whole WordPress accessibility team for having me. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dana. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is, do you consider that the multiple truths viewpoint is reflected in the fact that there's frequently no one true solution to web accessibility questions?
That's a great question. So it is something that I, you know, think about because I totally, you know, align with this idea that digital accessibility is a fluid social construction. And by that, I mean, you know, accessibility means something different, I think, to each person. So I really, you know, hesitate kind of when, you know, accessibility is defined as, you know, X, Y, and Z. I think it really is dependent on local context and, you know, again, tying back to this concept of intersectionality, it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that, you know, accessibility doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sort of touches on these different dimensions of identity. So I certainly think that there's a connection there. And thanks for pointing that out for who asked that question.
So the next question is, what would you like to see done with your research? Do you have goals for it?
Yes, this is another great question. I mean, I think hopefully you know, would love to publish my research in an academic article, but you know, that is a pretty intense process, but you know, it's something that I hope to do. And also next year, I hope to, you know, fingers crossed, I'll be able to go to Morocco with the Fulbright program to do a research grant where I can sort of continue this research and, you know, approach it from a different lens of studying digital accessibility within a specific context, as opposed to, you know, this research today. I recognize it's, you know, quite broad. So I think it would be exciting to sort of go at it from a different angle and be more specific.
Are you hoping that it'll inspire certain actions either at the government level or among people who work in digital accessibility on a daily basis?
Sorry, can you repeat that real quick?
Oh, I was just following up on that question. Are you hoping that your research would inspire certain actions either at the government level or with those of us that work in accessibility on a daily basis?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that would be great. You know, I think the one, um, you know, main takeaway that I really hope my research can share is that I think, you know, my personal experience working in digital accessibility, sometimes it can feel, you know, a bit, you know, lonely if, you know, going back to that scenario where there was one person on this team who's considered the expert. I feel like you know, when I was conducting this research, I think it made me feel quite an appreciation for the community and, you know, knowing that there are lots of people all over the world who really care about digital accessibility. And if you're working on this project, you know, you're not, if you're experiencing something, there's probably someone somewhere who is experiencing something similar. So if you can sort of find, you know, reach out to the community and, you know, uh, make connections and feel this sense of camaraderie, I think that would be something I hope that is inspired through this research.
Yeah, I know that that is definitely something with WordPress, right? And accessibility as well. But we're very big on community building. So there's a question here. Do you have ideas about ways to get people excited about the creative aspects of accessibility instead of viewing it as maintenance tasks?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think, um, let's see how to structure this. Well, you know, one example that I want to, you know, I think would be great to draw attention to is there's this project called Alt Text as Poetry. And you know, the specific authors kind of, I can't recall them off the top of my head, but hopefully I can, you know, add a link in the chat.
Shannon Finnegan?
Yes, yeah, yeah. And then so I think this is, you know, a really brilliant project because the you know, they really exemplify how you know, alt text is can, you know, some people can view it as, you know, the static rigid practice, but it's in a way I feel like it is sort of a poetic form, and they really, you know, encapsulate that. And I think projects like that are really exciting. I know there's also, you know, a movement in the zine world to sort of push for digital accessibility and sort of, you know, when there are artistic projects like that, that I think that can be really exciting, and it's something that excites me.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and it's actually my question. I'm wondering, how do you propose to increase the valuation of digital accessibility? So, you know, we see a lot of almost like fear-based arguments for accessibility, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on ways to increase that valuation that's maybe not fear-based, or do you feel like looking at the social that that is just the way to go?
I mean, that's a great question. I feel like it's something I sort of debate internally as well, because I mean, I think we do live in sort of a call out culture where fear is sort of can be a driving force. However, I think, you know, that's not the only way to go about it. I think, you know, grassroots activism and sort of going back to, you know, the social model of disability, I'd say that the grassroots kind of tactics used in activism can also be used for digital accessibility at, you know, in this idea of increasing value. And then also, I want to say, you know, there is strength in numbers. And I think, I guess I've mentioned it a lot now, but I would say, you know, but I keep saying it because I think it's really important. This idea of community and, you know, fostering support, you know, between different accessibility experts and practitioners is really important to show, you know, we are, you know, a strong group of people who, or strong, like numerous group of people who, you know, really care and want to advocate for digital accessibility.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you for having me.
yes. So thank you everyone for attending this WP